Welcome back to our course on Python. Let's now study the difference between class variables and instance variables. We have our class mammals. We will form the constructor define double underscore init method, and let's have the arguments self and name. As we studied, we write self.name equals name. Self.name here is stored for each specific mammal. So we call it an instance variable. While our class variables are shared among all instances of the class because they belong to the class itself, not the instance. They are defined outside the class method. Here is our method, the define init function. And so outside this function, we will start by creating our class variable. So let's say life equals living creatures. Because we created a class of mammals and we want to just tell that they are alive and they are living creatures. Now we define another function inside our class, the move function. Define move self, movement. What does this move function make? It prints using the F string here a placeholder self.name. Outside the placeholder, to continue our sentence, we print can, and we want to mention our motion, so another placeholder, and we mention self.movement. Let's define another function inside the class of mammals. We just take our shift tab here and we define the new function give birth. It prints, let's take our print here, a self.name gives birth. Now let us construct our first instance or class object, shift tab, and let's call it mammal1. We create our instance by mentioning the name and it belongs to the class mammals. The name is dog. This is our instance here. Once the instance is created, it can call any attribute or any function. So let's call the attribute give birth. Yes. And let's call the move function using dot and the name of the function. We print here walk. What's the difference between those two functions or instance methods? The first instance method, move, has two arguments. One of them is self, and we must mention the movement whenever we mention it outside the class of mammals. That's why we introduced walk. Give birth has only one argument, which is self. No other arguments are added, and therefore whenever we call it outside the class mammals, we do not need to apply anything between the brackets. The function move is the instance method, and also the function give birth is an instance method, another instance method here. Of course, there is no placeholder here. Of course, life equals living creatures. This is a class variable, again, shared among all instances because it belongs to the class itself, not individual objects. It is defined outside the class methods. These are the three class methods we have for class mammals, and life equals living creature is a variable that was defined outside the class methods. Therefore, it belongs to all instances. Let's try to call it now using mammal1, using the syntax instance dot method, which is life, just selected from here. Let's precede it with print, and let's have our run. Now we have an interesting error here, which is called attribute error. Mammal's object has no attribute movement. What does this mean? Let's differentiate between three things. First, the class variable, which is the variable that belongs to all created instances, mammal1 and any other mammal that will be created, mammal2, mammal3, and so on. Name, which belongs to the specific object created and therefore is called instance variable. So we have a name for mammal1, another name for mammal2, and a third name for mammal3, and so on. However, movement is a method parameter, which means it's only a temporary variable, and therefore we can never use it with self. So if we get out this self and rerun our program, there will be no errors. Mammal1 is the first instance created. It calls the method giveBirth and prints a dog gives birth. The name dog is an attribute that is passed to name here. A dog can walk is printed on calling the move method. Also, we can call the class variables by print instance dot the class variable here. Let's create another object, another class object, which is called an instance. Mammal2 here is a bat that can fly. And let's create a third instance, mammal3, a whale that can swim. And let's rerun our program here, and we have this output. Let's now cancel mammal1 and study what we will expect. Let's run. Let's have a run here. Yes, it says a bat gives birth, a bat can fly, and then it runs the mammal3 dot methods and prints a whale gives birth, a whale can swim. Let's introduce another class variable here, a counter for the mammals. So far we have 3 mammals, mammal1 and mammal2 and mammal3. So let's introduce examples of mammals equals 0. And let's call it inside the init function using the name of the class dot examples of mammals plus equals 1, which means every time the init function is instantiated by creating an instance, examples of mammals, this variable will increase by 1. So on creating mammal1, it is 1. By creating mammal2, it is 2. On creating mammal3, it is 3. So let's activate mammal1 here. Mammal2 is created also, but let's reduce the statements here. And let's print using the f string all mammals are and have our placeholder mammals.life, which is our class variable, and add the words and they count, and we introduce the variable here, mammals dot example of mammals. Let's have our run. All mammals are living creatures and they count 3. All mammals are the class variable life, living creatures, and they count 3 because I'm creating each instance. Examples of mammals was increased by 1. So variables outside the class methods are class variables. Variables inside are instance variables. The init function or the init constructor runs automatically when you create any object. Move takes 1 extra argument and therefore prints the movement of each mammal, while give birth has no extra arguments and therefore just prints a simple statement. This concludes our video on class variables and instance variables.